Hello everyone, today we talk about the making of Ukrainian national identity in Habsburg Galicia essentially from the end of the Polish partitions to World War I excluded, and we'll see that later on. And this chapter is particularly important because of all the processes of that, let's say, developed the sense of modern Ukrainian identity. This was the one that had a longer lasting and probably stronger based substance for further political institutional development of the country, and thanks to the representative structures of the Habsburg Empire. And so one may wonder, how did properly the Ukrainian idea became modern national politics in the Habsburgic Empire, essentially? As we've seen, the majority of Ukrainians at that point were in the Russian Empire, and as such they also provided, importantly, with very substantial cultural input to the same Russian culture and identity, something that, as we will see here in Austria, also played a role. It's paradoxical in a sense, in part because it was more contrasted politically in the local, say, political balance of Galicia. In fact, these lands in the Habsburgic Empire that had formerly belonged to the Polish kingdom, fundamentally, had a greater degree of Polish dominance. Right? In Austrian Galicia, the Polish elite was stronger than in Russian Ukraine. We have seen that, of course, the Polish elite was essentially probably either the Polish or Polonized local elite in the lands of Ukraine that had survived. In fact, also within the Russian Empire, from a cultural point of view, great part of, in fact, Ukrainian culture was Polonized in a way. Kiev was essentially a Polish city still in the culturally speaking, in the 19th century under the Tsars. So the lands that had been seized by Austria from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as you know, were essentially the smaller chunk, right, compared to the Russian one was the largest, and the Prussian one. Also, the most backwards, telling the truth. They were largely just agricultural areas. The Prussians, after all, kind of modernized. Well, if you think about Warsaw, for example, largely developed under Russian administration, it was essentially one of the largest, paradoxically, industrial centers in Europe, in an area like Central Eastern Europe, where largely, was say, backwards in terms of industrialization in the first place. So the Austrians, these lands were known as Galician Lodomeria, right? They had been acquired by the Habsburgs between 72 and 95. I mean, the Polish, the beginning and the end of the Polish partition. And there were essentially 2 million people there. It was mostly East Slavic and peasants. The Catholic Poles, as we've seen, were the available ruling class historically in the area, and Galicia was probably further controlled by Polish landholders under Habsburgic domination, and the country here, I've put some up, it was quite large and different ethnically, because the western part was fundamentally more Polish in nature. That was Krakow there, that had been historically the capital of the Polish kingdom in the Middle Ages, was the largest city, albeit it was incorporated only in 1848. Whereas the eastern part, that is fundamentally today's western Ukraine, had its major city, in fact, in Lvov, in Polish, but Lviv actually in Ukrainian, was instead mostly, in fact, East Slav, was Ukrainian. Still, however, with an important Polish elite. So, to make a brief assessment of the demographics culturally, we'd see in the western half of Galicia an 88% Polish, 7.1% Jewish, the rest being essentially Germans and Eastern Slavs. In the eastern part of Galicia, instead, there were 65% Ukrainians, 22% Poles, and 12% Jews. And this ethnic picture fundamentally remained unaltered up to World War I. Although the initial Austrian land reforms scarcely improved the condition of the Ukrainian peasants, religious reforms by the Habsburgs began to provide with some great potential of change, because in 1774 the Empress Maria Theresa redefined properly the Uniate Church of what had been created in 1596 in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as the Greek Catholic Church, which was equated to the same Roman and Armenian Catholic churches in the empire. So this was an important measure to after all, satisfy the demands of the locals in terms of participation. This was the age of the Enlightenment. The Habsburgs were very progressive, and in this sense they had to cope with properly a quite multicultural empire that couldn't be kept together if not by modernizing along these patterns. In 1775, Maria Theresa opened 14 places for Greek Catholics at the Barbarian Academy in Vienna. Her son and successor, Joseph II, founded a general seminary for Greek Catholics in there were three names fundamentally of Lviv at the time. In fact, Lviv, Lemberg in German, Lvov in Polish, in 1783. So he opened properly the Lemberg University in 1784 as well. And between 1787 and 1809, this university included a studium Ruthenum, so a Ruthenian studium, for those Greek Catholics that did not know Latin well enough to attend the regular courses. And this is interesting because you know that Ruthenia was considered as fundamentally this land, the stretch south of Lithuania. It was the old Rus, right? So what we could overlap it with Ukrainian at some level. In Latin, it was called like that. Ukrainian wasn't quite, I think, present in the official titling, but culturally speaking, we're talking about the same thing. And this is interesting because, of course, it shows that, like in Eastern Europe, like Latin traditionally had not been quite the Jesuits of the Commonwealth, as we've seen, had spread knowledge of Latin, etc. We were talking about the clergy, people who had to study in seminars, etc. This, Latin literacy was perhaps not the best, but it's still important that the Habsburgs worked to give an opportunity for those who wanted to be better educated in the language. And this was important because, of course, the United Church was, of course, in Latin fundamentally. So there was no immediate, in this sense, change or consequences that would derive from these reforms as, in social terms, because still those who studied to become also properly priests, etc., were normally part of the of the Polish high culture in general, right? Those that had been Polish gentry that would most end up to be the priests, whereas the faithful, the communities of faithful, were largely Ukrainians. And therefore it's fair to say that the Greek Catholic Church, so how the Habsburgs had retitled the Uniate one, were mostly still an expression of Polish culture and of the Polish elite that had ruled in those lands. As we've seen, this Galicia was in part properly Polish historically, in the truest sense. The eastern one was still, the majority of people were Ukrainian, but still the elite was Polish. And the presence of the Greek Catholic Church in the Habsburg Empire was very important politically speaking, because the church had been fundamentally would be eliminated actually in the Tsarist Empire, and already after 1795 it had received an important blow, as we've seen in Tsarist ruled Ukraine. It had become a minority, and the Orthodox Church was fundamentally revived more strongly there. So the idea that it was an autonomous Greek Catholic Church that enjoyed some representation and was elevated to the same status of the Catholic one in the same Catholic Habsburg Empire was a big deal. It would leave maneuver for some further autonomy and therefore identity at the same time. Lviv's episcopate was elevated to the status of metropolitic seat in 1808. This still happened in an hour of Polish culture and language. There was some student in the general seminary who would publish works in Galician Ukrainian as early as the 30s of the 19th century. But this didn't have really an institutional character, nor in the church nor in the state. But it's important to stress, because naturally this was the 19th century. Gradually in the Central and Eastern European lands there was a general improvement of the living conditions, etc. And so people coming also from lower social status, that were therefore more likely to be Ukrainian ethnically, began to express themselves in their language. The most important of these students was Markian Sheptyts'kyi, who was, however, son of a noble family who had spoken Polish for generations, meaning that, of course, also the Polish or Polonized elite was recognizing the necessity at a local level to, with some also ambitions at a national one probably, to express themselves in the language of the people, of the majority. The word church meant that also began to publish grammars of Ukrainian in German or Polish. So there was also an interest in these years, since the 18th century. There were, German historians, French historians who would started, as we've seen, writing histories of Ukraine, who were thus interested also in the language, and so vocabularies began to spread, etc. So there is a watershed represented by the 1848 revolution in Europe that, as you know, struck very deeply in the Habsburg Empire. There were many nationalities within the same who tried to gain their independence, notably also the Poles, right? So what actually happened at this point is that during the revolution, some Austrian officials, in order to curb the ambitions of the Polish elite of Galicia, began to make leverage on the Ukrainian element of the population. Some Ukrainian leaders that were starting to gain an important weight also within the same Greek Catholic clergy, right? And naturally this was done at the time. It was really the 1848 revolutions were terrifying, right? For in many ways, it's as if imagine, right? Today we see it in kind of modern secular perspective, say, okay, well, this was a process of democratization, of constitutionalism. Yes, that is important, but at the time it was really something violent. It's as if now there was a communist revolution and people began to take over the capitals, to shoot in the streets and things like that. It was terrifying, right? So still, this was a world that needed further civilization. The governments repressed harshly these movements. These were all a consequence of the French Revolution, of the enriching of the masses, of the ambitions, of fact, of self-determination, and so on. And especially regimes like the Habsburgic one, the Tsarist, generally the Central Empire, the Central Empires in Russia were just by culture, by tradition, in Central Eastern Europe, kind of more repressive, more traditionalist in this regard. And so it was a desperate situation, really, that also brought the Austrians to make veiled, at least to make appear the possibility of veiled concessions to, in fact, some elements like the Ukrainian ones in Galicia, in that circumstance, in anti-Polish function. In fact, serfdom was abolished, and for a brief time, peasants were given limited representation, even in the Austrian parliament. And in 1850, an imperial patent promised equal treatment to Ukrainians, right? So there was already from the Habsburgic government, a definition, an enucleation of what was becoming properly an instance of Ukrainian national reivindication. And even if this was in anti-Polish function, it revealed, of course, the awareness, the existence of such identity. Of course, these changes wouldn't bring to the removal of the Polish ruling class in Galicia. But the same Poles began to understand the atmosphere in this post-revolution situation, because that these revolutions would be just a step after the other of, let's say, the attempt of containing the democratic reforms after the Restoration, and as we've seen, the Habsburgic Empire was kind of more vulnerable to such instances. There are these very big steps, 1848, 1867, right? Where the empire was sensibly weakened by internal and external, aggression fundamentally. And between 1849 and 1859, there was a reinjection, let's say, of Polish nobility in key posts in the Austrian administration, which was led by, in fact, a Polish count, Algernon Goluchowski, which created ever more distance between the Polish gentry and the Ukrainian peasantry. As a consequence, Ukrainians were fundamentally disappointed by the Habsburgic government that had promised them, as we've seen, more liberty, and that instead eventually led again a form of repression by still using the Polish element that in general had created the same problems to the empire, but that, say, socially speaking, was more desirable, right? Just to maintain properly the establishment, the hierarchy within properly the cultural ideal of that world, of course, nobility that ruled over the peasantry. And so many Ukrainians within the same Greek Catholic Church began to look at Russia. And the reason why they were doing this wasn't really the fact that they liked, let's say, the Russians more than the Poles, or that they were anxious to be incorporated within the Russian Empire, right? But it's obvious that in the increasing tension also existing between the Austrian and properly with 1867 the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia, the Galician proximity to the Russian Empire would be played, as a factor against Vienna by the instances of local autonomy and reforms. 1867, as you know, is the moment of the creation of the Doppelmonarchie. Hungary acquired the same status of Austria in the empire. The Prussians had defeated the Austrians. The Italians had taken essentially the northern Italy from Lombardy, from the empire. It was the richest land, so it was a moment of deep, let's say, deep crisis, right, where all these also national identitary reivindications were galvanized in a sense. And at this point, Vienna granted informal autonomy to Galicia, still in terms favorable to the Polish aristocracy, but still in a way that would drive fundamentally this land towards the necessity of, as a whole, of some sort of political autonomization that could not be properly just a Polish one conceptually, because this was another country, right? Poland, of course, would not exist up to the end of World War I again as an independent country. So Galicia was still kind of living now as a reality on its own, and there was some, and so in the struggle between Austria and Russia, at this point Galicians were starting to look back paradoxically at Ukrainian identity as something properly more identifying of the country in itself, because they had recognized, as we've seen also in previous videos, how the same contemporary Russian as a culture had been created properly by Ukrainian scholars during the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is a thing. As we've seen, Ukraine was dramatically more developed from a cultural point of view than the Muscovy at that point. So it had provided an incredible number of scholars, which had favored the creation properly of the Russian modern state when Peter the Great, his patriarchs of Ukrainian origin, and etc., the opening literally of the Muscovy to more modern culture and language. And this was true indeed. So in this sense, Galicians were starting to regard what was the condition of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian lands, at least in the Tsarist Empire, where, as we've seen exactly in those years, properly an idea of properly of an overlapping between Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian land was beginning to happen, especially from an intelligentsia center such as Kharkiv was. There was also the old land of the Hetmanate, so those lands that had integrated the longest in the Tsarist domination, and that would reach its peak with the Crimean War, right? So we are more or less so in the 50s, so we see here in between the 40s and the 60s what was happening in the Habsburgic Empire at the same time. So there would be a coming together in part of Ukrainian culture across the Habsburgic and the Tsarist empires to create a continuum in for both empires in essentially this decentralized areas, right? That, however, were in contact with each other, in fact, and that could make a greater leverage for the revindication of a national instance of Ukraine. So consider that the Uniate Church had been properly cancelled from the Russian Empire in 1875. As a necessity, those who in the Greek Catholic Church in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were looking at Russia were, in a sense, necessarily looking also at a sort of reconnection of their church with the Orthodox one. In Ukraine, it was stronger, right? So this was not much, again, a matter of supporting the Tsars per se, but just realizing that most Ukrainians had been fundamentally Orthodox, right? Just by culture, by tradition, properly the peasantry had been. So the United Church was, as we've seen, a compromise that the Ukrainian Polonized elites had made to be part of the Commonwealth, but the majority of the people, the masses that in the 19th century were becoming ever more important, was still Orthodox. So there would be yet a reapproaching with the East in this fashion, unavoidable. And for this reason, Vienna began to support the same Greek Catholic Church in function of, let's say, against Russia in its borderlands. Began essentially to give more importance to the Greek Catholic tradition and consequently to the people who were part of that, in the hope that Galicia would not lean ever more towards Russia. And in 1882, just for making you understand how tense the situation was, there were some Greek Catholic individuals who persuaded a village, for example, to convert to Orthodoxy, and asking permission to the Austrian government to see it recognized. So this was a danger, right, in the face of the Tsarist Orthodox Empire altogether. What counterbalanced this, though, was the language aspect, because, as we've seen, the Greek Catholic Church had been dominated by Polish in language, whereas the peasantry spoke Ukrainian largely. So Vienna began to be more sympathetic for properly the Ukrainian, the spread of Ukrainian language properly meant. In order to counterbalance this, the Habsburgs understood that they could support Ukrainian identity against Tsarist imperialism. So they contributed to define better the instance of Ukrainian national independence. And this followed essentially also the Vatican agreement, right? It was better to promote, for example, properly a Ukrainian church in language and culture rather than the Russian one at the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this, in fact, took properly within the Greek Catholic Church some struggle, because there were some, let's say, we can't call them Ukrainophiles and Russophiles, even though, as we've seen, they weren't really like Russophiles or Polophile, whatever you want to call them. It was just like an internal factionalism to play essentially a local policy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this thing went on for essentially the 80s of the 19th century. And in fact, there was also Ukrainian representation in the Austrian parliament, the Reichsrat properly, so that brought to some interesting measurement of the growth of this policy, because by 1879 the Greek Catholic elite only had 3 representatives in the parliament. This had dropped from a previous 17. After that, so with properly the opening to Ukrainian language from the side of the same Galician elite, in 1889 there was an electoral success instead of the Greek Catholic elite, the Austrian parliament, which proved how much Ukrainian culture and language could unify Galicia and provide it with political cohesion in the international scenario and representation and so on. So in this phase there was a shift, right, from Polish culture to essentially the Russian one over time, from the 18th century to the 19th century. This seems paradoxical, again, because we think this as if it was, generally speaking, that they were looking towards, being under the Tsars. It's not quite the thing. It was just realizing that within the Habsburgic Empire, such great possibility of the coalescence of Ukrainian independence properly could be achieved at some point, and that this couldn't happen but with the reconnection with the largest part of Ukraine that was at that point within the Tsarist Empire. So actually it was simply a recognition in Galicia that the majority of Ukraine was under the edge of another empire, but that this wouldn't have to limit properly the potential, the possibilities, and the liberty of a Ukrainian nation. That was seen, in fact, after the 90s of the 19th century as a reality divided between the Habsburgs and the Tsars. This is crucial in importance. Because even just if you think about it, Ukrainians are Eastern Slavs, right? So the fact that there was a Polish national ambition and common, an intersection, historically speaking, there was no doubt. But of course, that point mainly we're talking about the lands of the Old Rus, right? Doesn't matter that they had ended up under the Muscovy, the Tsar, the Russian Empire, the Tsars. The important was to recognize that Ukraine existed as a whole. And this would have been, in fact, it would be historically a big deal and a great game changer in Eastern European history. And of course, together with this all happened through the Greek Catholic channel, right? The church had a primary role in this, right? Because it was also seen gradually as the mean of the medium of emancipation for millions of Ukrainians. And we're talking largely about the peasantry. Andrei Sheptyts'kyi was named the Metropolitan of Galicia in 1900, in a moment in which it seemed properly that this Ukrainian nation was already born politically. And if you think back at the time where Leo Sheptyts'kyi proposed Empress Maria Theresa of Habsburg to grant Greek Greek Catholicism the equal status with the Roman Catholic one within the same Habsburgic Empire, this was actually a very quick process, right? It was substantiated by the cultural reality of Ukraine. Leo's descendant, Andrei Sheptyts'kyi, the greatest clergyman in 20th century Ukrainian history, found himself in Galicia at the head of 3 million Ukrainians, who had thus equal status with the Roman Catholic Poles in the same country, in the empire thus. So in the process, starting from, say, 1875, there was an opening of hundreds of schools in the country teaching properly Ukrainian, right? So not Latin, not Polish, but largely, for the majority, Ukrainian, right? So this would fuel further the national orientation of the country, and in the process, the same Greek Catholic Church democratized itself, because there were many more people now that were not just simple peasants or properly serfs up to, the mid-19th century. These were literate peasants who were literate in Ukraine, right? And this would allow, within the same church, fundamentally just by sheer demographics, for the Ukrainian character to take over the older, essentially Polish, Polonized one. So this was an enormous deal for the history of Ukraine, and we will look at what Galicia also was concretely, more in detail in this national, international scenario. For today, we stop it here. I thank you for listening. See you next time. Bye.